Do you know this problem? You have a lovely scene that you want to draw. Trees, shadows, fence. But there's all this ground in it. How do we draw all this ground and make it as interesting as the other parts of the scene? Let me show you my strategy, my technique for drawing the ground in this sort of scene. And then I'll demonstrate the techniques drawing this scene. The ground doesn't have to be an awkward thing that we quickly do at the end. My first strategy is more a realization and understanding that nature is messy. There aren't many clean, straight lines in nature, and there aren't many in this scene. There are some lines that are close-ish to being straight, but there's a lot of very small lines. In fact, a tangle of very small lines, particularly on the ground, but also in the trees. If we frequently draw buildings, as I do, we can get used to drawing lots of straight lines that establish our scene very quickly. But with nature, that's just not possible. But there is a quick way we can establish the areas that our various elements are going to take when we can't draw long lines. And of course, we're talking about drawing freehand in ink, so we can't draw any lines, in fact, that we're not prepared to still have there at the end of the drawing. So particularly watch the first moments of my demonstration, because you'll see quite clearly how I establish where the various elements are going to be. We certainly can't get away with drawing things like this early on in our drawing. My second strategy is to understand how the perspective of the scene works. And you might be thinking, but there are no buildings, there is no perspective. There is always perspective in anything we see. It's just that with buildings, it's more obvious. The perspective that particularly affects this scene is foreshortening. You may have seen it explained with diagrams such as this. Foreshortening is the perspective principle that says as an object moves further away, it narrows. And so as this wall moves further away, the windows look narrower and narrower. And in fact, the gaps between the windows look narrower and narrower. And if the wall moves away at a greater angle, if it moves away more quickly, in fact, this happens at a faster rate, then the narrowing becomes more extreme. There are 7 windows, which means in the first diagram, this is the halfway point in the wall. In the second diagram, though, this is the halfway point in the wall, which is much further along, relatively speaking, than in the first example. But perspective doesn't just work on walls moving away from us. It also works on the ground moving away from us. But with the ground, the angle is usually greater. Unless we're looking up a hill, the angle is greater than this and even greater than this angle, which means that the foreshortening happens in a more extreme way. And between here and here, the halfway point is actually here, which means that the detail I draw here is actually also in this much smaller space as I go further back. So my line work has to reflect that. And while I haven't worked it out, if I were just looking at this forward section, the halfway point from here to here is probably about here. And we can see what that means is we can see the detail that's closest a lot more than we can see further up. In fact, while down here, we can see leaves and sticks. Up here, we really can't see what anything is, except because we can see this, we can presume what's up there with the marks that we can see. And we want to use this in our drawing technique. The other thing to realize is that often in scenes such as this, in the foreground, we're more looking down, more looking straight down even on the ground surface. But that as it moves away from us, we're looking more and more side on at it. Objects that we can see in the very foreground could quite rapidly become almost straight lines as they move further away. So that means that what we draw down the front here, just a bit further back, might be much smaller, and a bit further back very small, and further back, we're not going to really be able to see it at all. So I need to make sure that the scale with which I draw things takes into account this foreshortening. And I can also help create the effect of depth by using a thicker pen closer to the front, because that can represent the fact that objects closest to the front are seen more clearly. They have a more definite form than objects further back. My other strategy is, because the ground has shadow on it and the sun is at quite a low angle, there are all sorts of patterns of light and dark that I want to be able to suggest, at least in parts, and sometimes drawing by negative space is the best way to do this. If I look at the shadow from this telegraph pole, I need to forget what it is, because that may just mislead me, and just actually focus on what I see. There is grass here where all of the grass is in the shadow, and yet there's grass here that goes into the shadow which is completely in the light. How we try and capture this effect in our drawing with our line work will partly determine our drawing style for this scene, and therefore the overall appearance. But there are lots of values, and because there's quite a lot of brighter areas because of the extreme position of the sun and darker areas, then I need to be prepared to do enough lines to get the contrast between light and dark to create that early morning feel to our scene. But I'll outline the further points while you're watching me draw them in the demo. So let's start. Which I do by drawing some lines to contain the tangle of lines that this scene is going to result in. And you can see me now just trying to get the angles of this roadway, or sort of bush track roadway that we have here. The angles are quite important because I want to get the angle of the shadow approximately the same as it is in the reference, because I like it like that. Now I have these shadows in the bottom right corner, which as I draw this, I'm not real sure how I'm going to do those. I'm thinking that could be the trickiest part of the scene to get looking satisfactory for me. But you can see I've done lots of basically dotted lines, which is the approach I mentioned earlier, because it doesn't really matter whether I align with those or not. They're hardly going to show up at the end of this drawing when there are so many lines in place. And you can see straight away I'm trying to establish the shadow, because I want to have it as one of the features, because it's this shadow that says early morning. So that's a fairly important visual clue to what's happening here. And I also want to draw the wires of the fence in negative space. So that's going to be one of the technically not so much tricky as just things I'll need to be more careful with drawing, that I leave clear a white line to represent those wires catching the sunlight. And I'll probably exaggerate more than what we see in life, simply because I think, again, visually it's an important way of saying this is a fence which goes alongside a road. Because there are so many tangled things in this scene, and without colour they're going to look even more tangled, I really need to rely heavily on the few clues that I've got about what's actually happening in this scene. So I'm working through the trees on the left. I'm using a 0.3mm pen so far, and towards the end I actually darken all of this considerably. I thought I was happy with it, but as I looked at the overall values of the scene towards the end, I felt that they needed adjustment, they needed more work. Now you can see that down the front here I'm drawing some obvious leaves and sticks and stones and bits of this and that, but as I go further back I'm not drawing so many, and I'm not drawing them in detail. Now you'll see I just did some hatching in the bottom right corner, which doesn't really relate to anything except the general direction of the land at that point, but not the actual surface of the grass that's coming up. But I thought reflecting the shape of the ground, the direction of the ground underneath it, was the best I could do at this point. But I wanted to commit to lines there now so that I didn't get precious with it later. And I took a little bit of time working out exactly what was happening in this corner where I am now. I kind of got lost in those original marks that I made. There is this yellow wattle tree, which really is defined by negative space. And that also was a bit of a tangle to try and leave. But I did want to have at least a suggestion that something was happening there that was different to what was around it. And then there are these trees at the end of this short section of it's actually an access roadway to the railway. But I never intended to draw the gate at the end or the house on the end of the street on the other side of the railway. I was always presuming to make that shrubs. Now, I almost made the telegraph pole a tree, and I began to put foliage around it, and then I realized that that would mess up the shadow. So I've had to hope I can make that foliage look like it's belonging to a tree in the distance. But again, I've learnt not to get too worried about mistakes, and that tree I'm making darker just to distinguish it from the ones on each side to represent a tree much further away. And I tried to use smaller lines and to do smaller shapes just to indicate distance for that tree. And now I'm going back working over a lot of the hatching that I've done. I'm trying to increase the overall darkness, the overall value that we have here, and make it darker. But I don't want to get rid of too many of the white spaces too quickly, because, well, I can't bring them back with a pen, can I? The more I look at it, the more I think that it's looking a bit scratchy, and some more solid blocks of darkness would actually bring it together more and have it look more complete. And so I'm having to work out what I'm doing in this bottom corner now. And there are also some other shadows that aren't the telegraph pole, and I begin to do those, and then I realise that the angle isn't quite right for the angle of the telegraph pole, and so I have to change them slightly from how they actually are on the reference, just to get them, I think, tilted in a better direction. But still doing lots of work down here in this bottom right corner. I'm also working out what final marks I'm going to put on the actual road surface, or trail surface. It's more of a trail than a road, I guess. And so I'm really just now, as I draw this, I'm standing up and looking at it through the camera that's held above the paper, so I can just see it in a different way, shrunk smaller. It's easier to see it with fresh eyes, and it lets me get a sense of the lights and the darks and how I think they're working as a whole, as opposed to looking at different parts of it where I might need to strengthen the values, or at least the line work in certain parts. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. Areas such as the ground are often weak points. It can be difficult with this vast expanse, whether it's the ground or whether it's a road, whether it's pavers. Sometimes they end up being this large, fairly boring wedge shape that can often take up a third or even a half of our drawing space. So it's good to work out ways, techniques that we can actually incorporate whatever details, whatever clues we have, whatever's in our reference, to make it come alive, make it real in some way. And you probably know the drill by now. I've put this photo on my channel community page, so you can have a go at drawing this rather vast expanse of ground yourself if you want. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.